Hey everyone, welcome to Larson in the Lab. Well, actually, it's kind of story time. Okay, so this is a book that I'm going to read a little bit to you. It's a book called A Short History of Nearly Everything by a writer named Bill Bryson. Bill Bryson is not a scientist, he writes literature. And he wanted to write a book that people could understand some science ideas, but not a complicated textbook like that. He instead chose to write about science ideas by looking through the lens of the scientists who made these discoveries. He helps us understand those scientists' life, how they made the discoveries, and then helps break down the science to help us understand what he's talking about. So instead of a lab, you're going to have a story time this time. So here it goes. I wanted to share this with you because I really love this book. It was assigned to me in ninth grade, the summer before ninth grade. It was my summer reading. Okay. I went to a nerdy science high school. So that's just how it was. But look at this thing. That was really intimidating. I was scared to read this book, but when I read it, I just really enjoyed it. And you can see I did a lot of highlighting back in the high school days. And I just particularly remembered this passage as I was thinking about teaching you guys about DNA. And I want to share it with you. So here it goes. I'm just going to read the story to you. It's just a little bit. So had you been a betting person in the early 1950s, you would almost certainly have been betting on Linus Pauling of Caltech, America's leading chemist, to crack the structure of DNA. Linus Pauling was unrivaled in determining the architecture of molecules and had been a pioneer in the field of X-ray crystallography, a technique that would prove crucial to peering into the heart of DNA. In an exceedingly distinguished career, he would win 2 Nobel Prizes, for chemistry in 1954 and for peace in 1962. But with DNA, he became convinced that the structure was a triple helix, not a double one, and he never quite got on the right track. Instead, victory fell to an unlikely quartet of scientists in England who didn't work as a team, often weren't on speaking terms, and were, for the most part, novices in the field. Of the 4, the nearest to a conventional boffin was Maurice Wilkins, who had spent much of the Second World War helping to design the atomic bomb. 2 of the others, Rosalind Franklin and Francis Crick, had passed their war years working on mines for the British government, Crick the type that blow up, and Franklin the type that are used to produce coal. The most unconventional of the foursome was James Watson, an American prodigy who had distinguished himself as a boy as a member of a highly popular radio program called The Quiz Kids, and thus could claim to be at least part of the inspiration for some of the members of the Glass family in Franny and Zooey and other works by J.D. Salinger, the author, and who had entered the University of Chicago at just age 15. Imagine being 15 and going to college. He had earned his PhD by the age of 22 and was now attached to the famous Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge in England. And in 1951, he was a gawky 23-year-old with a strikingly lively head of hair that appears in photographs to be straining to attach itself to some powerful magnets just out of frame. Crick was 12 years older and still without a doctorate, and was less memorably hirsute and slightly more tweedy, kind of a nerdy guy. In Watson's account, he presented a blustery, nosy, cheerfully argumentative, and impatient with anyone slow to share the notion, and a constantly in danger of being asked to go elsewhere. So Crick was not very well liked by people. Neither of Watson or Crick were formally trained in biochemistry. Their assumption was that if you could determine the shape of DNA molecule, you would be able to see correctly, as it turned out, how it did what it did. They hoped to achieve this, it would appear, by doing as little work as possible beyond just thinking, and no more of that than was absolutely necessary. Can anybody relate? As Watson cheerfully, if a touch disingenuously, remarked in his autobiographical work called The Double Helix, it was my hope that the gene might be solved without my learning any chemistry. They weren't actually assigned to work on DNA, and at one point were actually ordered to stop it. Watson was ostensibly mastering the art of crystallography, and Crick was supposed to be completing a thesis on X-ray diffraction of large molecules. Although Watson and Crick enjoy nearly all of the credit in the popular accounts for solving the mystery of DNA, their breakthrough was crucially dependent on the experimental work done by their competitors, the results of which were obtained fortuitously. In the tactful words of the historian Lisa Jardine, far ahead of them, at least at the beginning, were two academics at King's College in London, Wilkins and Franklin. The New Zealand-born Wilkins was a retiring figure, almost to the point of invisibility. Like, he just wasn't that impressive. In the 1998 PBS documentary on the discovery of the structure of DNA, a feat which he shares the 1962 Nobel Prize with Watson and Crick for, they managed to overlook him entirely and didn't include him in the PBS documentary about DNA. Wow. But the most enigmatic character of all was Franklin. A severely unflattering portrait of her is painted by Watson in The Double Helix, and it depicts Franklin as a woman who was unreasonable, secretive, chronically uncooperative, and this seems especially to irritate him. He said she was almost willfully unsexy. Wow. He allowed that she was not unattractive and might have been quite stunning had she ever taken a mild interest in clothes. But in this, she disappointed all expectations. She didn't even use lipstick, he noted. And while her dress sense showed the imagination of an English blue-stocking adolescent. So he just really had a lot of comments to say about the way she looked and dressed and how she was really a scientist who didn't care what other people thought about how she looked. He didn't like that. So, however, she did have the best images in existence of the possible structure of DNA achieved by means of X-ray crystallography, the technique perfected by Linus Pauling. Crystallography had been used successfully to map the atoms in crystals, hence crystallography, but DNA molecules were much more finicky proposition. Only Franklin was managing to get good results in the process, but to Wilkins' perennial exasperation, she refused to share her findings. If Franklin was not warmly forthcoming with her findings, she really can't be blamed. Female academics at King's College in the 1950s were treated with formalized disdain that dazzles modern sensibilities and actually any sensibilities. Basically, they were treated really badly. However senior or accomplished, they were not allowed into the college's senior common room, but instead had to eat their meals in a more utilitarian chamber that even Watson concealed was dingy and poky. On top of that, she was constantly being pressed, at times actively harassed, to share her results with the trio of men, Wilkins, Watson, and Crick, whose desperation to get a peek at them was seldom matched by more engaging qualities like respect. So they didn't respect her, they just wanted her work. I'm afraid we always used to adopt, let's say, a patronizing attitude towards her, Crick later recalled. Two of these men were from competing institutions, and the third was more or less openly siding with them. It should hardly come as a surprise that she kept her results locked away. The fact that Wilkins and Franklin did not get along was a fact that Watson and Crick seemed to have exploited to their benefit. Although Crick and Watson were trespassing rather unashamedly in Wilkins' territory, it was with them that he increasingly sided, not altogether surprisingly, since Franklin herself was beginning to act in a decidedly strange way. Although her results showed that DNA was definitely a helical shape, she insisted that it was not, so she was trying to trick him. To Wilkins' presumed dismay and embarrassment, in the summer of 1952, she posted a mock notice like a flyer all around King's physics department that said, "It is with great regret that we have to announce the death on Friday, the 18th of July, 1952, of the DNA helix. It is hoped that Dr. M.H.F. Wilkins will speak in memory of the late helix." So she was trying to throw them off of the trail that DNA was actually a double helix shape by making this kind of joke. It would be like almost like if she posted on social media like, "Oh, that's not true." There's just to get them on the wrong path. It's kind of cool. Anyway, she's a little smart and a little funny. The outcome of all this was that in January of 1953, Wilkins showed Watson Franklin's images, apparently without her knowledge or consent. It would be an understatement to call it a significant help. Years later, Watson conceded that it was a key event that mobilized us. Armed with the knowledge of DNA's molecule's basic shape, some important elements of its dimensions, Watson and Crick redoubled their efforts. Everything now seemed to go their way. At one point, Pauling was en route to a conference in England, at which he would, in all likelihood, have met with Wilkins and learned enough to correct the misconceptions that had put him on the wrong line of inquiry. But this was the McCarthy era, and Pauling found himself detained in the Idlewood Airport in New York. His passport was confiscated on the grounds that he was too liberal of temperament to be allowed to travel abroad. This is during the Cold War. Crick and Watson also had no less convenient good fortune than Pauling's son was working at Cavendish and innocently kept them informed of any news or developments and setbacks back at home with Linus Pauling. Still facing the possibility of being trumped at any moment, Watson and Crick applied themselves feverishly to the problem. It was known that DNA had 4 chemical components called adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, and that these paired up in particular ways. By playing with pieces of cardboard cut into shapes of molecules, Watson and Crick were able to work out how the pieces fit together. From this, they made a mechano-like model, perhaps the most famous in modern science, consisting of metal plates bolted together in a spiral. And they invited Wilkins and Franklin and the rest of the world to have a look. Any informal person would see that they had solved the problem. It was without question a brilliant piece of detective work, with or without the boost of Franklin's picture. In the April 25, 1953 edition of Nature, a journal, they carried a 900-word article by Watson and Crick titled A Structure of Deoxyribose Nucleic Acid. Accompanying it were separate articles by Wilkins and Franklin. It was an eventful time in the world. Edmund Hillary was just about to clamber to the top of Everest, while Elizabeth II was imminently to be crowned Queen of England, so the discovery of the secret of life was almost overlooked. It received a small mention in the News Chronicle newspaper, and it was ignored elsewhere. But Rosalind Franklin, unfortunately, did not end up sharing the Nobel Prize for this discovery. She died of ovarian cancer at an age of just 37 years old in 1958, 4 years before the award was granted. Nobel Prizes are not awarded posthumously, meaning not awarded to people who have passed away. The cancer almost certainly arose from the results of chronic exposure to X-rays and through her work that were exposed through her work and needn't have happened. In her much-praised 2002 biography of Franklin, Brenda Maddox noted that Franklin rarely wore a lead apron and often stepped carelessly in front of the beam. Oswald Avery never won a Nobel Prize for his work either, and also was largely overlooked by posterity, but though he did have the satisfaction of living long enough to see his findings vindicated. So Rosalind Franklin didn't receive credit for her work. She was actually kind of disrespected by the guys, Wilkins, Watson, and Crick. But the discovery that she made in that picture of X-ray crystallography of DNA was world-changing. Like, without her work, the scientists Watson, Crick, and Wilkins and the others would not have been able to discover the structure of DNA. And the story just kind of goes to show that. I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit from A Short History of Nearly Everything. If you're interested in this book, feel free to borrow it from me or check it out at a local library. And you can find out a lot more about other scientific discoveries that have been made through the lens of Bill Bryson. Thanks for listening.